The cruelest invitations are the ones wrapped in gold. Naomi Carter stood beneath the crystal chandelier of the Grand Astoria Hotel, while cold November rain slid down the glass behind her like silver threads. The valet line stretched across the curb in front of the building, black SUVs arriving every few seconds beneath flashes of cameras and soft jazz drifting from the ballroom upstairs. Women in designer gowns stepped out laughing beside men, wearing tuxedos worth more than most people's rent. Naomi adjusted the sleeve of her black satin dress and stared at the enormous engagement photo hanging above the entrance. Ethan Brooks smiled beside a blonde woman nearly 20 years younger than her, his hand resting proudly on the diamond at the woman's finger. Below the photo, elegant gold lettering read, "Ethan and Vanessa, a celebration of love and new beginnings." Naomi's invitation trembled slightly between her fingers as the doorman scanned it twice before frowning. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quietly. "Your name isn't on the VIP access list." Naomi looked past him toward the glowing ballroom upstairs where laughter echoed beneath orchestral music. "Check again," she answered softly. The man hesitated before lowering his voice. "I did." A couple walking behind her glanced over with polite curiosity before whispering to each other. Naomi could already feel the humiliation warming her skin beneath the winter air. She should have known Ethan planned this. He never humiliated people directly. He preferred polished cruelty, the kind hidden behind expensive manners and perfect smiles. A few feet away, Vanessa suddenly appeared at the top of the staircase wearing a silver gown covered in crystals that shimmered beneath the chandelier lights. "Oh my God," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Naomi actually came. Several people turned. Naomi recognized some of them immediately. Old friends, former colleagues, people who used to sit in her apartment eating takeout, while Ethan pitched impossible business ideas at their tiny kitchen table years ago. Back when Naomi worked double shifts at a downtown insurance office just to keep the lights on. Ethan appeared moments later, adjusting the cufflinks on his tuxedo with calm confidence. Success looked good on him now. Wealth had softened his rough edges and replaced them with arrogance. He smiled when he saw her, but the smile never reached his eyes. "You made it," he said casually. "I wasn't sure you would." Naomi studied him in silence. The same blue eyes. The same voice that once whispered promises against her forehead at 2 a.m., while bills piled beside their bed. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal. "You could have texted first. I would have told security to expect you." Vanessa laughed softly beside him, sipping champagne. "Babe." Maybe she thought this was open to the public. A few guests chuckled politely. Naomi felt every sound land against her chest like tiny needles, but her face never changed. She simply smoothed the black glove along her wrist and lifted her chin slightly beneath the chandelier light. Ethan noticed it then. The calmness. No tears. No anger. No desperation. That unsettled him more than if she had screamed. "Anyway," Vanessa continued sweetly, "we're about to start the toast upstairs." She looked Naomi up and down slowly. "But I'm sure you understand this is really more of an intimate celebration." Naomi finally smiled, small and unreadable. "Of course," she said gently. Then her eyes drifted toward the ballroom entrance above them, where executives, investors, and politicians moved beneath oceans of gold light, completely unaware that the woman standing quietly at the bottom of the stairs belonged in rooms far more powerful than this one. Naomi stepped back into the rain before Ethan could say another word. The hotel doors closed behind her with soft elegance, sealing the warmth and music inside, while cold Manhattan air wrapped around her shoulders. Across the street, headlights reflected against wet pavement like broken gold ribbons. For a moment, she simply stood there beneath the dark sky, listening to the distant sound of laughter from the ballroom windows high above her. It reminded her of another night years ago when Ethan had laughed the exact same way inside a tiny apartment with stained ceilings and a broken heater that clicked all winter long. Back then, there were no chandeliers, no champagne towers, no photographers waiting outside hotels. Just two exhausted people sharing instant noodles at midnight while snow piled against their fire escape. Ethan used to sit at their small kitchen table surrounded by rejected business proposals and unpaid bills, rubbing both hands through his hair until frustration turned his voice sharp. Naomi still remembered the cheap desk lamp casting yellow light across his tired face while she stood beside him in her office uniform after working 12 straight hours downtown. "Nobody takes me seriously," he had whispered once, staring at another rejection email glowing on his old laptop screen. Naomi had walked behind him quietly and placed both hands on his shoulders. "Then make them regret it later," she told him. He looked up at her like she was the only solid thing left in his life. That was before investors started returning his calls, before expensive suits replaced clearance rack jackets, before success taught him how quickly people forget who stood beside them at the bottom. Naomi closed her eyes briefly as a taxi splashed rainwater across the curb nearby. She remembered typing his presentations at 2 in the morning because Ethan struggled with wording under pressure. She remembered proofreading contracts while eating microwave dinners in silence because there was never enough time. When Ethan lost his first major client, Naomi sold the gold necklace her mother left her so he could make payroll for his employees. He cried that night when she handed him the envelope of cash. "I swear," he told her, holding her hands across that tiny kitchen table, "one day I will buy you everything you deserve." But promises always sound sincere before power enters the room. Naomi slowly walked beneath the hotel awning toward the empty corner of the block. Above her, giant windows revealed glimpses of the engagement party glowing like another universe. She spotted Ethan briefly through the glass, shaking hands with investors, smiling confidently beside Vanessa while servers carried silver trays through the crowd. Nobody inside that ballroom knew how many nights Naomi spent sleeping on hospital chairs beside Ethan's mother after her stroke, while Ethan traveled for business meetings. Nobody knew Naomi once missed rent payments to help fund the company Ethan now proudly called self-made. The phrase used to make her laugh at first, then eventually it stopped hurting enough to matter. Her phone vibrated softly inside her purse. One unread message appeared across the screen from an unknown number. "You should not have come tonight." Naomi stared at the message for several silent seconds before locking the screen again. The rain continued falling steadily around her while traffic crawled through the glowing Manhattan streets. Across the avenue, a black car waited quietly beside the curb with headlights dimmed beneath the storm. Naomi did not recognize the vehicle, but she noticed something strange. The driver had been watching the hotel entranced the entire time. As she moved farther down the sidewalk, the car slowly pulled away from the curb and followed at a careful distance through the rain, while upstairs inside the ballroom, Ethan Brooks raised a champagne glass to celebrate the future he believed he built entirely on his own. The black car continued following Naomi for 3 blocks before finally stopping beside the sidewalk near Lexington Avenue. Rain tapped softly against the polished roof while steam rose from the subway grates beneath the cold midnight air. Naomi tightened her coat around herself but did not stop walking. Manhattan at night always felt different in November. The city lights looked softer through rain, almost unreal, like every window carried a secret behind it. "Ms. Carter." The voice came from behind her, calm and measured. Naomi turned slowly. A tall older man stepped out of the car, holding a large umbrella beneath the storm. His charcoal overcoat looked perfectly tailored despite the weather, and silver streaks cut through his dark hair at the temples. There was something strangely familiar about him, though Naomi knew they had never met. "I apologize for approaching you this way," he said politely. "My name is Arthur Bennett." Naomi remained silent. Years beside Ethan had taught her successful men often hid intentions behind polished manners. Arthur noticed the caution in her eyes and gave a respectful nod. "I work for Lauron Holdings." The name landed quietly between them. Even Naomi recognized it immediately. Lauron Holdings was everywhere in New York. Luxury hotels, commercial towers, investment firms, museums. Their names sat on half the skyline. Arthur opened the back door of the car. "Mr. Lauron asked me to deliver something personally." Naomi frowned slightly. "I do not know Mr. Lauron." "No," Arthur replied softly. "But he knows who you are." Rainwater slid down the umbrella as Naomi stared at him without moving. Manhattan traffic glowed behind them in blurred rivers of red and gold. Finally, Arthur reached into his coat and removed a small velvet box no larger than a jewelry case. "This belonged to your mother," he said. Naomi froze. The sound of the rain seemed to disappear for one suspended second. Very few people ever mentioned her mother anymore. Most of those memories lived buried beneath years Naomi no longer allowed herself to revisit. Arthur carefully placed the box into her hands. "There are instructions inside," he continued. "You are not obligated to respond tonight." Naomi looked down at the dark velvet resting against her gloves. Her pulse slowed strangely. "Why now?" she asked quietly. Arthur glanced briefly toward the distant glow of the Grand Astoria Hotel behind them. "Because some truths become dangerous when they stay hidden too long." Before Naomi could answer, Arthur stepped back toward the car. "Mr. Laurent also asked me to tell you something else." Naomi lifted her eyes. Arthur's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You were never forgotten." The car door closed gently behind him. Seconds later, the vehicle disappeared into the rain-soaked traffic, leaving Naomi standing alone beneath the streetlight with the velvet box still resting in her hands. Her apartment was 20 minutes uptown inside an older brownstone building with narrow stairs and a radiator that hissed all winter long. It was not glamorous, but it was peaceful. No photographers, no investors, no performances. Naomi placed her keys on the kitchen counter and slowly opened the velvet box beneath the dim light above the stove. Inside rested a gold key attached to a small ivory tag. One sentence had been written carefully across it in fading black ink. "For Naomi, when she is ready." Beneath the key sat an old photograph folded once through the center. Naomi unfolded it carefully. Her breath caught instantly. The picture showed her mother standing beside a massive marble staircase inside an estate Naomi had never seen before. Beside her stood an older white man wearing an expensive navy suit with one hand resting protectively on her mother's shoulder. On the back of the photograph, written in elegant cursive, were 4 words that made Naomi's chest tighten beneath the silence of the apartment. Carter Dominion Winter Gala, 1998. Naomi stared at the name for a long moment while thunder rolled softly outside her windows. Then her phone vibrated again across the kitchen counter. Another unknown number. Another message. This one contained only an address in downtown Manhattan, followed by a single sentence. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. It is time you learn who your family really was." The address led Naomi to Lower Manhattan just after sunrise, while pale winter light stretched between the steel towers of the financial district. The rain from the night before had disappeared, leaving the streets glossy beneath the morning traffic. People hurried past carrying coffee cups and leather briefcases, moving with the cold efficiency only New York seemed to perfect. Naomi stepped out of the taxi and slowly looked up at the building standing before her. Carter Dominion Tower. The name rose nearly 60 stories into the gray sky and polished silver letters above revolving glass doors guarded by men in dark suits. Naomi felt her pulse tighten quietly beneath her coat. She had seen the company name before. Financial magazines, museum sponsorships, international business articles Ethan used to leave scattered around their apartment while studying successful corporations. Carter Dominion was old money, generational power, the kind that never needed attention because it already owned the room before entering it. Naomi stared at the gold key, still resting inside her purse. For years she believed her mother died with nothing except unpaid medical bills and old photographs hidden inside dusty boxes. Yet somehow her name was connected to one of the most powerful companies in America. A doorman opened the entrance before Naomi could reach for the handle herself. "Good morning, Miss Carter," he said respectfully. Naomi paused for half a second. Nobody had ever greeted her like that before. Inside, the lobby looked more like a museum than an office building. Black marble floors reflected enormous crystal lights overhead, while quiet piano music drifted softly through hidden speakers. Executives crossed the room in expensive coats, but several glanced toward Naomi with strange recognition the moment she walked inside. Not curiosity, recognition. That unsettled her more. At the far end of the lobby, Arthur Bennett waited beside a private elevator with both hands folded calmly in front of him. "Right on time," he said gently. Naomi approached slowly. "What is this place to my mother?" Arthur studied her carefully before answering. Everything she walked away from. The elevator doors opened silently behind them. As they rose higher above Manhattan, Naomi watched the skyline spread beneath the glass walls. Her reflection stared back at her faintly against the city view. Black gloves, dark wool coat, calm posture. She suddenly remembered Vanessa laughing the night before about class and belonging. The memory no longer stung the same way. The elevator finally stopped on the top floor. The doors opened into complete silence. No crowded offices. No ringing phones. Only a long hallway lined with artwork and framed black and white photographs dating back decades. Naomi followed Arthur slowly until they reached enormous double doors made of dark walnut wood. Arthur stopped there. "Before you walk in," he said quietly, "you should understand something. Mr. Laurent did not protect this secret for financial reasons." Naomi frowned slightly. "Then why?" Arthur lowered his voice. "Because your mother asked him to." He pushed the doors open. The room beyond overlooked the entire city through floor-to-ceiling windows glowing with pale winter sunlight. A long conference table stretched across the center, surrounded by nearly a dozen men and women in tailored suits. Some older, some younger, all powerful. Every conversation stopped the instant Naomi entered. Then something happened she never expected. One by one, every person at the table slowly stood to their feet. The silence inside the room deepened until even the soft hum of Manhattan traffic below seemed distant. Naomi felt her breath catch slightly as the people before her looked at her not with pity or judgment, but respect. Real respect. At the head of the table stood a tall, white-haired man holding a leather folder against his chest. His blue tie carried the Carter Dominion crest embroidered near the seam. "Miss Carter," he said warmly, "we have been waiting a very long time for you." Naomi looked around the room carefully, confusion mixing with something far heavier beneath her calm expression. "I think you have mistaken me for someone else," she said softly. The older man smiled sadly. "No," he replied. "The mistake was allowing you to grow up believing you were ordinary." Then he opened the leather folder slowly and turned it toward her, revealing an old family photograph placed carefully beneath the glass sleeve inside. Naomi stared at the image in silence as the color slowly disappeared from her face, because standing beside her mother in the photograph was the exact same older man now standing across from her inside the boardroom of Carter Dominion Tower. Naomi could not stop staring at the photograph in the older man's hands. Her mother looked younger there, elegant in a dark emerald gown with pearl earrings resting against her neck beneath the glow of an enormous ballroom chandelier. She was smiling softly beside the man now standing across the conference table from Naomi. The resemblance struck her all at once. The same eyes, the same calm expression, the same quiet posture that never demanded attention, yet somehow held it naturally. "My name is Charles Carter," the older man said gently, "and I am your grandfather." Silence settled across the room, so deeply Naomi could hear the faint ticking of the antique clock mounted near the windows. Outside, Manhattan stretched endlessly beneath the pale winter sky, while helicopters drifted between skyscrapers far below. Naomi slowly lowered herself into one of the leather chairs beside the conference table because suddenly her knees no longer trusted her balance. "My mother never told me any of this," she whispered. Charles nodded once, sadness moving through his face like an old memory returning. "Your mother left this family when she was 26 years old." He glanced briefly toward the skyline before continuing. "She fell in love with a man the board considered unacceptable. A jazz musician from Harlem with no money and no social standing." Naomi felt her chest tighten quietly. Her father. She barely remembered him except for old records spinning softly in their apartment when she was a child and the smell of cedar cologne lingering in hallways after he left for performances. "When your father passed away," Charles continued carefully, "your mother refused to come back here." Naomi looked up slowly. "Why?" Charles hesitated. For the first time since entering the room, the powerful executives surrounding the table suddenly looked uncomfortable. "Because she believed this world destroys people who love too honestly." The sentence landed heavier than Naomi expected. Arthur Bennett quietly placed a thick folder beside her on the table. Inside were photographs, legal documents, newspaper articles, and handwritten letters spanning decades. Naomi turned pages slowly while her pulse echoed softly in her ears. Pictures of charity galas, private estates in Europe, business magazine covers carrying the Carter Dominion name. Then one image stopped her completely. Her mother holding Naomi as a baby outside this exact tower nearly 30 years earlier. Naomi stared at the photograph in disbelief. "She brought me here?" Charles smiled faintly. "Only once." His voice softened. "You were 6 months old. She stood exactly where you entered this morning." Naomi looked around the room differently now. The marble floors, the paintings, the silver crest engraved into the conference table. Suddenly none of it felt unfamiliar anymore. It felt buried, like memories inherited through blood rather than experience. "Why contact me now?" Naomi finally asked. Charles exchanged a glance with Arthur before answering carefully. "3 months ago, your mother's final trust officially transferred ownership rights to the remaining Carter heir." Naomi frowned slightly. "Remaining?" A shadow crossed Charles's expression. "Your uncle passed away last year. His sons sold their shares and left the company." He paused quietly. "That leaves only you." The room fell silent again. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the documents spread before her. Billion-dollar financial reports rested inches from her fingertips beside handwritten letters from her mother she had never seen before. One envelope carried Naomi's name in delicate cursive across the front. Her throat tightened instantly. "She wrote to me?" Charles nodded. "Every year." Naomi looked up sharply. "What do you mean, every year?" Arthur answered softly this time. "Your mother left instructions that the letters could only be released if you chose to return willingly." Naomi stared at him in disbelief. Charles slowly pushed the stack of sealed envelopes toward her across the polished wood table. Some were faded with age, others newer. 15 years of unopened letters tied together with a dark silk ribbon. Naomi touched the top envelope carefully while emotion moved quietly beneath the calm expression she fought to maintain. Then suddenly another folder slid across the table from one of the attorneys seated nearby. "There is one more matter requiring your attention," the attorney explained carefully. Naomi opened the folder and immediately recognized the name printed across the top contract proposal. "Brooks Innovations Strategic Expansion Partnership. Ethan's Company." Naomi stared at Ethan's company name printed across the partnership proposal while sunlight stretched across the conference table in long pale lines. For several seconds, she said nothing. The silence inside the boardroom felt almost ceremonial now, as if everyone understood they were watching two different worlds slowly collide. Brooks Innovations, the same company Naomi helped build from a tiny apartment with secondhand furniture and overdue utility bills. Ethan used to practice investor pitches in front of their bathroom mirror because it was the only place with decent lighting. Naomi remembered standing behind him straightening his tie before meetings while he nervously rehearsed words like expansion and acquisition. Back then he still looked at her like she mattered more than success. Charles Carter slowly took the folder from her hands and closed it gently. "Your former husband has spent the last year pursuing a strategic partnership with Lauron Holdings," he explained. "If approved, the agreement would nearly triple the value of his company." Naomi leaned back slightly in the leather chair, while Manhattan shimmered beyond the glass walls behind the executives. "And what does that have to do with me?" she asked quietly. Arthur Bennett exchanged another glance with Charles before speaking. "Lauron Holdings answers to William Lauron." Naomi recognized the name instantly. One of the wealthiest men in America. Private investor. Philanthropist. Media outlets called him the man who never attended his own press conferences. There were almost no public interviews of him anywhere online, despite his influence touching nearly every major industry in New York. Arthur continued carefully. "Mr. Lauron requested that all final decisions regarding Brooks Innovations be postponed until after your arrival." Naomi frowned. "He does not even know me." A faint smile crossed Arthur's face. "That is where you are mistaken." Before Naomi could respond, the conference room doors opened quietly. Every executive at the table immediately straightened in their seats. The reaction alone told Naomi someone important had entered before she even turned around. Footsteps crossed the marble floor with calm precision. No rush, no performance, just quiet authority. Naomi slowly looked toward the doorway. The man standing there appeared younger than she expected, perhaps early 40s, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit without a single visible logo or unnecessary detail. His dark hair carried slight silver at the edges, and his expression remained composed in a way Naomi instantly recognized. The kind of calm wealthy people develop when they never need to prove power out loud. William Lauron. He studied Naomi silently for a moment while the room remained completely still around them. Then his gaze softened almost imperceptibly. "You have your mother's eyes," he said quietly. Naomi felt something strange move through her chest at the sentence. Not fear. Recognition. as though this man somehow belonged to chapters of her life she had never been allowed to read. William approached the conference table slowly before placing a small envelope beside her unopened letters. "Your mother asked me to give this to you personally if this day ever came." Naomi stared at the envelope. Her name was written across the front in her mother's handwriting. William remained standing beside her chair while morning sunlight reflected across the skyline behind him. "I promised her I would wait until you found your own way back here," he continued. "She never wanted you raised inside this world unless you chose it willingly." Naomi looked up at him carefully. "You knew my mother?" For the first time, something almost painful crossed William's composed expression. "Very well." The room fell silent again. Naomi slowly opened the envelope with careful fingers while every executive respectfully lowered their eyes. Inside was a single handwritten note folded once through the center. Naomi unfolded it beneath the sunlight pouring across the table. "My sweet Naomi, if you are reading this, then it means life finally brought you back to the truth I tried so hard to protect you from. I did not leave because I was ashamed of where I came from. I left because I wanted you to know love before power changed the meaning of it." Naomi's throat tightened instantly beneath the stillness of the room. Then her eyes reached the final line written at the bottom of the page. "And when you meet William Laurent, trust him. He has protected you longer than you realize." 3 nights later, Manhattan glittered beneath thousands of lights as black cars lined the entrance of the Laurent Winter Foundation Gala. Snow drifted lightly across Fifth Avenue, melting against the polished sidewalks while photographers crowded behind velvet ropes outside the historic Beaumont Hall. Inside, crystal chandeliers illuminated ceilings painted with gold leaf, while a live orchestra played soft jazz beneath the low murmur of billionaires, politicians, and media executives moving through the ballroom in tailored tuxedos and silk gowns. Ethan Brooks adjusted the cuff of his black tuxedo while studying the crowd with controlled confidence. This was the night he had spent nearly a year chasing. One successful partnership with Laurent Holdings would push Brooks' innovations into a completely different level of influence. Investors already treated him differently just because his company had reached the final negotiation stage. Vanessa stood beside him wearing a diamond necklace, so bright it caught flashes from every nearby camera. "Relax," she whispered smoothly while fixing his bow tie. "By tomorrow, you will probably own half this room." Ethan smirked faintly, though tension still lived beneath his calm expression. Laurent Holdings remained impossible to predict. Meetings were delayed, contracts postponed, final approvals mysteriously stalled without explanation. Even tonight's invitation arrived at the last minute with no guarantee Ethan would actually speak to William Laurent personally. Across the ballroom, executives laughed beside champagne towers while servers carried silver trays through clusters of guests dressed in black and gold. Ethan scanned the room again, searching for familiar faces, when suddenly Vanessa's expression shifted beside him. "You have got to be kidding me," she muttered under her breath. Ethan followed her gaze toward the entrance staircase. Naomi had just entered the ballroom, but this time, nothing about her resembled the woman standing alone outside his engagement party in the rain. She wore a floor-length ivory gown with long satin gloves and understated diamond earrings that reflected the chandelier light with quiet elegance. Her posture remained calm, unhurried. She did not look impressed by the room because somehow she looked like she belonged to it more naturally than anyone else inside. Conversations nearby subtly slowed as guests turned toward her without fully understanding why. Naomi moved through the ballroom with measured grace, while several powerful figures immediately approached to greet her. Ethan frowned slightly. Who invited her? Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. Maybe she found another way inside. Yet even she sounded uncertain now. Naomi did not carry herself like someone sneaking into wealth anymore. She moved like someone raised around it. Ethan watched carefully as an older senator shook Naomi's hand warmly before introducing her to 2 executives from Paris. Another couple smiled at her with immediate recognition. None of it made sense. Ethan started toward her before Vanessa grabbed his arm lightly. "Do not make a scene," she warned quietly. But Ethan was already moving through the crowd. Naomi noticed him approaching several seconds before he reached her. Still, her expression never changed. "Naomi," Ethan said carefully, lowering his voice beneath the orchestra music. "I did not expect to see you here." Her eyes met his calmly. "Neither did I." Ethan studied her appearance more closely now. The gown alone looked custom-designed. The diamonds at her ears were understated but unmistakably real. Even the people surrounding her carried themselves differently than his own business circle. Old money. Established power. Vanessa stepped beside Ethan with a controlled smile. "Beautiful dress," she said sweetly. "It almost looks expensive." Naomi simply looked at her for a moment without reacting. The silence unsettled Vanessa more than any insult could have. Then suddenly movement rippled through the ballroom entrance behind them. The orchestra softened. Conversations lowered. Several executives straightened immediately. Ethan turned instinctively toward the staircase as William Laurent entered the gala surrounded by board members and security. The entire atmosphere of the room shifted the moment he appeared. William greeted investors briefly before his gaze moved across the ballroom and landed directly on Naomi. Something unreadable passed through his expression then. Recognition. Respect. Perhaps something even deeper. Without hesitation, one of the most powerful men in America changed direction completely and walked straight toward Ethan's ex-wife, while hundreds of guests quietly watched. The ballroom seemed to quiet around William Laurent as he crossed the marble floor toward Naomi. Conversations lowered into whispers beneath the orchestra music while crystal lights reflected against rows of champagne glasses and polished black tuxedos. Ethan instinctively straightened his posture the moment William approached, ready to introduce himself properly, but William never even looked in his direction. His attention remained entirely on Naomi. "You came," William said softly when he reached her. Naomi held his gaze calmly. "You said this room would eventually belong to me." Something almost like pride moved through William's expression before he extended his hand toward her with quiet formality. Naomi placed her gloved fingers lightly against his hand, and the gesture alone shifted the atmosphere around them. Several executives nearby exchanged subtle looks immediately. Ethan noticed it. So did Vanessa. Because powerful people only move that carefully around someone equally important. William turned slightly toward the crowd gathering around them. "There are people tonight who should finally meet you properly." Naomi followed beside him through the ballroom, while Ethan remained frozen for half a second before quickly stepping after them. Servers moved aside instantly as William guided Naomi toward the center stage beneath the grand chandelier, where foundation donors and corporate leaders had already begun gathering for the evening announcement ceremony. The orchestra slowly faded into silence. Across the massive ballroom, cameras turned toward the stage while guests lifted champagne glasses and waited expectantly. Ethan's pulse tightened beneath his tuxedo. Something about the entire night suddenly felt unstable. Vanessa leaned closer beside him. "Why is William Laurent acting like he knows her?" she whispered sharply. Ethan did not answer. Because deep down, the same question had already started unraveling something dangerous inside him. William stepped onto the stage beside Naomi while the chairman of the Laurent Foundation adjusted the microphone at center podium. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," the chairman announced warmly. "Tonight marks not only another year of philanthropic partnership for our organization, but also the beginning of a historic transition within one of the most influential family legacies in American business." Soft applause moved politely through the ballroom. Naomi stood beside William beneath the crystal lights while hundreds of eyes remained fixed on her. Ethan frowned slightly. He still could not understand why so many powerful people seemed to recognize her already. The chairman continued speaking while enormous digital screens illuminated behind the stage, displaying black and white photographs from the Carter Dominion archives. Old galas, corporate milestones, political dinners spanning generations. Then one image appeared that made Ethan's expression slowly change. Naomi's mother standing beside Charles Carter at a charity event decades earlier. Murmurs spread quietly across the ballroom. Ethan glanced toward Naomi again, confusion sharpening behind his eyes now. Vanessa's champagne glass lowered slowly in her hand. "As many of you know," the chairman continued, "the Carter Dominion succession has remained unresolved for years following the tragic departure of Eleanor Carter from public life." Naomi's name had not even been spoken yet, but suddenly the room no longer felt casual. It felt historic. William looked toward Naomi briefly, almost asking permission without words. Naomi gave the smallest nod. The chairman smiled gently before lifting the final announcement card in his hand. "Tonight, Carter Dominion formally welcomes home the last surviving heir to the Carter family legacy. The screens behind the stage faded to black for one suspended second before a single name appeared across 50 feet of gold lettering. Naomi Carter. The ballroom fell completely silent. Ethan stared at the screen as if his mind could not process what his eyes were seeing. Around him, executives immediately began applauding, while several older investors actually rose to their feet. Vanessa looked physically pale beneath the chandelier lights. The chairman's voice echoed through the silence. Future chairwoman and majority heiress of Carter Dominion. Ethan's fingers loosened around his champagne glass. It slipped from his hand and shattered softly against the marble floor beneath him. Nobody turned toward the sound. Nobody cared, because every eye inside the ballroom remained locked on Naomi, while William Laurent stepped closer beside her and gently kissed the back of her gloved hand with unmistakable respect. "Welcome home, Miss Carter," he said quietly into the microphone. And in that exact moment, Ethan finally understood the full weight of what he had thrown away. For the rest of the evening, the ballroom no longer belonged to Ethan Brooks. It belonged to Naomi. Everywhere she moved, people stepped aside with effortless respect while executives introduced themselves one after another beneath the golden chandelier light. Investors who ignored Ethan minutes earlier suddenly watched Naomi with careful attention, as though her approval now carried more value than any contract inside the room. Ethan stood near the back of the ballroom, barely hearing the orchestra anymore. The shattered remains of his champagne glass had already been cleaned from the marble floor, but the humiliation still lingered beneath his skin like broken ice. Vanessa remained unusually quiet beside him. Even she understood there were levels of wealth and influence she had never imagined touching before tonight. Naomi had not merely walked into power. She had inherited an empire older than half the institutions represented inside Beaumont Hall. Across the room, William Laurent stood beside Naomi while Charles Carter introduced her to board members, foreign diplomats, and longtime family allies. Yet despite the attention surrounding her, Naomi never looked overwhelmed. She simply listened calmly, her gloved hands resting lightly around a crystal glass untouched for most of the evening. Ethan realized then what unsettled him most. Naomi had always carried herself this way, even back in their tiny apartment years ago, even when she worked double shifts and came home exhausted. The dignity had always been there. He had simply been too blinded by ambition to recognize it. Hours later, the gala slowly began thinning as guests departed beneath the falling snow outside. Naomi finally stepped away from the crowd and moved toward the quieter balcony overlooking Fifth Avenue. Cold winter air brushed softly against her face, while traffic glowed below like streams of moving gold. For the first time all evening, silence surrounded her again. "Naomi." Ethan's voice came quietly from behind her. She did not turn immediately. Snowflakes drifted past the balcony railing, while distant sirens echoed somewhere downtown. Ethan approached slowly, his expression stripped of the confidence he wore so effortlessly before. "I need to talk to you." Naomi finally looked at him. The city lights reflected softly in her eyes, calm and unreadable. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly before speaking again. "I did not know." Naomi said nothing. Ethan gave a hollow laugh under his breath. "That sounds pathetic now that I hear it out loud." He leaned against the balcony railing beside her, careful not to stand too close. "All those years," his voice tightened slightly. "You were carrying all of this and never said a word." Naomi looked back toward the skyline. "Neither did my mother." The orchestra music drifted faintly through the ballroom doors behind them. Ethan studied her profile beneath the winter lights. "Did you know back then?" he asked quietly. "When we were together?" Naomi shook her head once. No. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Regret settled across his face in slow, painful layers. Not because of the money. Not entirely. But because he suddenly understood the difference between success and value. He spent years chasing rooms full of powerful people while pushing away the only person who already belonged in them naturally. "I was cruel to you," he admitted softly. Naomi remained calm. "You were ashamed of struggling," she answered. "Then when you stopped struggling, you became ashamed of the people who remembered who you used to be." Ethan lowered his eyes again because there was nothing to argue with in that sentence. Snow continued falling around them in delicate silence. Finally, Ethan looked at her one last time. "Is there any chance," he began carefully, That we could start over? Naomi studied him for several long seconds. Then, very gently, she smiled. Not with anger. Not with triumph. Just clarity. You only see me clearly now because the world told you I was valuable, she said softly. But I needed someone who could see it when there was nothing to gain. Ethan's expression fell silent beneath the weight of the truth. Behind Naomi, the ballroom doors opened as William Laurent stepped onto the balcony, carrying her ivory coat across one arm. He stopped respectfully several feet away, giving her space without interrupting. Naomi glanced toward him briefly before turning back to Ethan one final time. I did not lose myself when you left, she said quietly. I found myself after. Then she accepted the coat from William Laurent and walked back inside beneath the golden ballroom lights, while the orchestra resumed softly in the distance. Ethan remained alone on the balcony watching the woman he once ignored disappear into the world she was always meant to inherit. And somewhere beneath the snowfall covering Manhattan, he finally understood that the greatest revenge had never been wealth at all. It was dignity.